That's a verse from this week's Torah reading. I didn't know they'd put it to a song. It's beautiful. Where Jacob says to God, basically, I don't deserve all this you're doing for me, which is correct. He didn't, right? It took him a long time to earn it, and it turned into a beautiful song in which we remind ourselves that we have so many blessings and ask ourselves, what have you done? What have you done with those blessings? Not to earn them, but what have you done with them? So, very special tonight. You have Noah Lederman. Originally, I look at this, you're from Orange County, California, and then you go to Columbia. You look for trouble, apparently, right? You start in California, say, okay, maybe I can find something as difficult over on the other coast, right? You skip the whole middle part of the country, middle America, a little bit calmer there. But you rose to the occasion. He's pursuing a degree in philosophy and political science and a degree in Jewish ethics at JTS. Joint program? Okay, I graduated joint program in 72. Over the past year, Noah, you didn't know they had a program. You didn't even know they existed in 72, right? Well, they did. That's when I graduated. Noah has been featured in several national news interviews. I saw you, particularly on the one on Fox Nation, Anti-Semitism on Campus, Students Speak. So I saw you there. I was so excited when Paul said you were in town and you would speak with us. His op-ed piece, this is really impressive. Jewish students are no longer safe at Columbia University. It's not the piece was great, but they published it in Haaretz. That's a shock, right? Because they don't really want to deal with this. But it was so impressive a piece, even Haaretz felt it had to be aired. In May, Noah attended several events in Washington, D.C. for Jewish American Heritage Month, including a security briefing at the White House and a reception at the Rose Garden, where he connected with prominent Jewish social media influencers and community leaders to share stories about rising anti-Semitism that he had witnessed firsthand at Columbia. He was also selected to be part of a small delegation of Jewish college students flown to Israel in June to bear witness to the sites of the Nova Music Festival and the Kfar Aza massacres. There, Noah had personal meetings with President Isaac Herzog, Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, spoke at the Knesset with several government officials, student president of Meor Student Board, active member of AEPI, I see AEPI all over the place here, and an REA outreach fellow, virtual reporter for Robert Kraft's new incredible foundation to combat anti-Semitism. And then afterwards, we're going to have some questions from Jake Feldman, who I'll introduce later. Noah, please join us on the Bima. Really privileged to have you here.
You made me sound so great. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. My name is Noah Lederman, and it's an honor to be here tonight. As was mentioned, I grew up in Orange County, California, which actually, while California itself may be as was described, I grew up in a sort of very small community, and I went to a Jewish day school from kindergarten to 12th grade. So when I say I grew up in a bubble, I really meant it. I grew up in a bubble. Before October 7th, my only real exposure to any sort of anti-Semitism was two incidents. One where there was some graffiti on a local synagogue near my school, and then a few years later, there was an incident where some high school students at a neighboring high school arranged their solo cups in the form of a swastika, and I was part of both of the initiatives after that to sort of educate why this is so wrong and so hurtful, because these were both incidents that were done by students. So that was my sort of first taste for dealing with ignorance and lack of understanding. Now, however, anti-Semitism has practically become part of my daily life at Columbia and in New York. Last year, as a freshman, it was my first year last year, I witnessed firsthand just how quickly anti-Semitism can become normalized, as the protesters went from initially saying pretty vague and ambiguous calls of from the river to the sea and sort of Palestine will be free, to saying go back to Europe, chasing us off campus, and pointing at us and calling us Al-Qassam's next targets, Hamas's next targets. The anti-Semitism that I experienced firsthand at Columbia revealed to me just how important it is to fight back with education and engagement. I spoke out against those protesters who were trying to shame Jewish students for their religion or their Zionism. I was on Fox News, ABC, CNN, and I was featured on Jonathan Greenblatt's ADL program, Not My Campus, the initiative, and I also joined the special program on Fox Nation. This is not enough. I also was fortunate to have been able to attend the House Committee on Education and Workforce's hearing on anti-Semitism. So many of you may have seen the president of Columbia embarrass herself in front of the Congressional Committee. I was sitting right behind her. And I have to say, I was so embarrassed. It was terrible. I mean, I'm sitting there and she can't answer basic questions. At Columbia, the protests and encampments were situated right in the middle of campus. It was impossible to avoid them. I got calls from friends of mine in April saying, no, I can't get to class. I can't get through them. I'm terrified. They were unable to get to their classes, their exams, and the professors were not understanding at all. Professors even held classes in the encampment so that students who were in the encampment didn't need to leave. They could receive instruction from inside. And of course, none of us Jewish students were able to enter. It wasn't uncommon this year or last year for me to see someone from my class who I knew at a protest wearing a keffiyeh and raging against Israel. I was shocked and horrified at the stance they took against our people and our community. So many times I tried to interact with these so-called pro-Palestinian protesters only to find that they had no idea what river and what sea they were talking about. It was as if the real facts and history of Israel just didn't matter to them. They couldn't see past the false propaganda that they had been fed. While I was in D.C. for the Jewish American Heritage Month, I had a private meeting with Speaker Johnson on the rapidly expanding anti-Semitism at Columbia University. Earlier that year, I and other brothers of the AEPI chapter at Columbia, we worked with the speaker's team to bring Speaker Johnson to campus. We brought him to our campus near the height of the encampment. And of course, he was booed and screamed at, but we stood behind him. The brothers of AEPI and other Jewish students stood behind him, and we stood in solidarity. And it was a signal to Jewish students that our concerns are being taken seriously at the highest level of government. We discussed how unprotected many Jewish students felt on campus and how unfortunate it was that Columbia had to shut down their in-person classes for the last 2 weeks of the semester, merely because the administration was unwilling to protect its Jewish students. In June, I was flown out to Israel to speak with Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Herzog about how Jewish students on college campuses can continue to help and support Israel and how Israel can support us in our fight. Because this is important. Jewish students have been drawn into a proxy war on college campuses, and we don't have the proper tools to fight the accelerating anti-Semitism and false narratives that I'm committed to fighting this in any way that I can, but it's not enough. Anti-Semitism is a structural and institutional problem at the universities, and administrations have, in many cases, been paralyzed in their responses. In their attempt and fear of interfering with their students' historic right to protest, they have completely ignored the blatant anti-Semitism and Jew hatred in these demonstrations. At Columbia, for example, toward the end of the semester, they refused to take down the second encampment, opting instead to take classes online and telling Jewish students, just stay away. Instead of giving out consequences for violating New York City laws and university bylaws, they just told the Jewish students to stay away. This is how they protected us. The actions of many universities, and Columbia and Barnard in particular, rescinding or failing to implement suspensions for the students, faculty, and administration who were engaged in the hateful activities, even in the most severe cases, such as the takeover of Hamilton Hall, is concerning because it undermines any efforts to hold those accountable who have tried to intimidate Jewish students on campus. There's a valid concern that these protesters and their outside agitators are only going to be emboldened by their success and lack of meaningful consequences. I want accountability from the university. The university needs to act upon their promise that anti-Semitism will not be tolerated. Otherwise, their words are nothing but empty promises that send a sinister message to Jewish students, a message that we've been abandoned. I am often asked if I worry that speaking so vocally about campus anti-Semitism will attract further negative attention. Well, the answer is yes. While I certainly have no intention of making myself a target for the ire and hatred of the anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic protesters, for me, staying quiet was never an option. I feel that I have an obligation to live the Jewish values that I hold so dear. That means speaking out against evil and hatred wherever we see it. Listen, we all know that there's a war going on that started on October 7th in Israel, and it's now being fought on the battlefields of Gaza by the brave men and women of the IDF. But this is not the only war, and this is something that's important to recognize. There's another war going on. It's a proxy war. This proxy war began in the West years ago as the BDS movement, boycott, divest, sanction. And for the longest time, it has remained largely dormant. We've been lulled into a false sense of security. But on October 8th, it became something else, something much more dangerous and insidious. It started with Middle East professors labeling the terrorist attacks as justified resistance. Professors outright told students at these universities that rape is resistance. I mean, we watched as the president of Harvard said that it depends on the context. There is no context that can justify this. Numb with grief and still in shock from the terror, from the horrific attack on Israel, American Jewish students were unprepared to respond to what we now know was a well-organized, well-planned, and well-funded multi-pronged anti-Israel propaganda campaign to destabilize political and financial support for Israel in the West. Almost a year and a half into fighting, and we're still unprepared. We are on the front lines of the battle of this proxy war, and we're losing. Our voices that are calling out for the release of the hostages are being drowned out by an overwhelming chorus of voices calling for a ceasefire that has become not just anti-Zionist, but in many cases blatantly anti-Semitic. Calling for a ceasefire without also calling for an unconditional release of all hostages is anti-Semitic. To turn the tide at Columbia and at other universities, we must get organized. I'm committed to working tirelessly, and so are many of my peers, to ensure that the narrative isn't stolen by those who hate us. Actually, I was just reading just now when we were listening to the beautiful services. I read a quote in the Siddur that talked about how Jews don't know despair. We don't know despair. We do what is right, and we continue in the face of the most challenging and the most violent enemies. We continue. We don't know despair. We don't give up. However, my advocacy extends many different ways. We talked about how I work with Robert Kraft, but I want to tell you about some of the other initiatives that I'm involved in and how those are being effective on Columbia's campus and on other universities. So, for example, with the AEPI Foundation, AEPI's Anti-Semitism Response Center, otherwise known as ARC, is an initiative that is vital because its support and resources are for students who are facing anti-Semitism on campuses nationwide. Through ARC, we're building a network of allies committed to combating hate and ensuring Jewish students feel safe and empowered. It's important that we can no longer simply afford to react, we have to be proactive. We need to arm students with the knowledge and tools they need to become advocates, not just for Israel, but for themselves. My sister is a senior in high school, and she was applying to colleges in the first part of this year, and a few months ago she called me, and in addition to having to worry about, as I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the SATs, the ACTs, GPA, everything, she called me and she asked me if she'll be safe because of her Judaism at the university she's applying to. And it broke my heart when my little sister asked me if she would be safe. And she told me she wanted nothing more than to come. She wanted to go to Barnard. She wanted to be with me. And she said she was scared that she wouldn't be safe there after seeing what happened to me when I spoke out for what I believe in. We need to arm students with the knowledge and tools they need to become advocates. Empowered and well-prepared, they can counter the hate and bring the truth to the forefront of Columbia and beyond. This fight is about more than just politics, it's about survival. It's not an issue of left versus right. It's an issue, it's just the right thing to do. The last thing I'll say is this: consider what fuels their disdain for Israel. They detest that Israel is a democracy. They despise its embodiment of Western values. This hostility extends beyond the mere anti-Israel and anti-Semitic sentiments. It's fundamentally anti-American. I've witnessed these students openly calling for the downfall of America, demonstrating how deeply their ideologies clash with the principles of freedom and democracy. They had, on Veterans Day, a ceremony at Columbia. They called it Martyrs' Day. I mean, really, honestly, when I was meeting with Bibi, he made the comment that many of you may have seen, that Queers for Palestine is the same as chickens for KFC. And while it's sort of meant and it listed sort of it's a humorous thing, really after considering that some more, I feel bad for the cognitive dissonance that these people must have to be able to to walk around campus carrying Hamas flags and Hezbollah flags and yet preach the very values that these terrorists are seeking to destroy. Their success depends on our silence, though. So this is very bleak, and I know I said that a lot of how we're losing, but we're gaining ground. Their success really depends on our silence, our lack of knowledge, our fear of speaking out, and our hesitance to confront this bigotry head on. So let's not let them win. Let's champion the cause of truth in the face of overwhelming falsehoods and stand firm against anti-Semitism and all forms of hatred. Let us take action, speak out, and hold our institutions accountable. We need to ensure that the narrative of Jewish students, of Israel, and of truth itself is heard loud and clear. It is our responsibility, our duty, to defend the ideals of democracy, justice, and peace. Together, we can turn the tide in this battle. Together, we can ensure the truth prevails. Together, we can win. Shabbat Shalom, and thank you for your courage and support.
So we also have with us Jay Feldman, and Jay is going to do some dialogue with Noah, Executive Director of AEPI. I'm guessing we have some AEPI people here or watching. And he has been involved, his career is amazing, focused on community building, Israel education, Jewish campus life. He was a Director of Community Relations and Campus Affairs at Federation Orange County in California. California again. And also past Director of the Hillel at the University of California, Irvine. Originally from just a little west of here, Coral Springs, Florida, living now in Maryland with his wife and with his daughter, and a family law attorney who also serves as Vice President on the National Council of AEPI Sorority. So he does it all. Thank you for being here, Jay.
Thank you. Normally, when Noah and I partner up like this, we're sitting on the stage in a fireside chat kind of setting. So it's a real honor to be here on Shabbat with you all and to just have a little bit of a conversation. Since there isn't a Q&A opportunity, I am going to channel your questions and ask Noah a couple of things that I think might be on some of your minds. So, Noah, you talked about your sister as she's looking at college campuses. And one of the things that's occurred in the last few years, not just since October 7th, certainly escalated since October 7th, is this question of, from parents and grandparents, should I send my son or daughter or my grandkids to a school that has a known reputation for anti-Semitism? And their feeling is, stay away. But what's your response? What's your reaction? What do you think about that?
That's a great question. So, as I mentioned, I grew up in California, and when I was applying to colleges my senior year of high school, I got into a few, whatever, and when I got into Berkeley, everyone told me, don't go to Berkeley. They're so anti-Semitic there. Don't go to Berkeley. They hate Jews there. Go to Columbia. They love Jews. Woo! So I guess I say that just that it shows you that it's scary to think that you really can't know where you'll be safe and where you won't be safe based on your Jewish identity, because people will find reasons to dislike us wherever we go. Now, the one thing I'll say is that I know people have talked a lot about, oh, don't go to these universities because they're so anti-Semitic, etc. I would say this. If we stop going, we let them win. If we stop going, there's nobody to counter the narrative. And there's a lot of students on universities. So the encampments were huge. They seemed huge. But if you look at the numbers and the statistics, I think it was less than 2% of students at universities actually participated in an encampment ever. I mean, there are thousands of students that on each campus, at Columbia alone, that never step foot in the encampment. So it's really important to recognize that there's so many students that are so impressionable, and if we don't have Jewish voices there, then they'll just be hearing from the people who are espousing this false propaganda. So I say that you should join your brothers and sisters and stand strong and stand tall and be proud.
Thank you, Noah. We get the question a lot, too, at AAPI from parents all over the country, and also with our partners at Hillel and Chabad on campus, and many other great organizations like Stand With Us or Students Supporting Israel. And Noah's absolutely right. We cannot have Jewish students disappear from the campuses where this fight is taking place. We need strong, proud, vocal advocates. And my next question, Noah, to you is one of the things that I've noticed, you've talked a little bit about, is seeing Jewish students, whether they come from strong Jewish upbringings or far less, they get to campus, they now see this, and many of them are actually stepping out into the light and wanting to get involved and active. So that, for some, that's a surprising thing to hear. What have you seen at Columbia with regard to that, and also among the brothers of API you've met across the country?
So I'll say that, as I mentioned, I grew up in a bubble, and there wasn't much Israel advocacy needed. But I have to say that I feel in many ways that I found my true calling, and that is sort of being a defender of the Jewish people. So I think that for all the sort of, we talked about bleakness of the situation, it's not as bad as it seems. So many Jewish students, Jewish involvement on campus, from what I've seen, again, it was my first year. I only had about a month. I tell people I only had a month of normal college because we started school in the beginning of September, and we only had a month until October 7th happened. And then after that, it was so abnormal. But what I saw is people have found their voice, and they found sort of a purpose, and it's empowered so many Jewish students to speak up for what they believe in and speak up for their people. So that's how I would respond to that.
Last week, I was at Columbia University at a special gathering of student leaders, and they had a panel conversation with students about this subject. And a young woman said, I grew up with nothing Jewish, and I would stay away. I didn't want to go to Hillel at Shabbat dinner or Chabad. And when this started, I said, I need to find my people in my community. So that's been one of the, we talk about what we call the surge. This is what's been something that's occurred in the last year, not just on campus, but also in the greater community as well. People who have been in the shadows and the hidden yidden are emerging, looking for connection and community, and we see this on campus as well. Noah, often when we have conversations like this in a setting, one of the questions that we'll get from the audience is, how can we be helpful? How can us here in this room who live in the greater North Miami Beach area, South Broward, where there's schools at UM and FAU and FIU and throughout the state, how can we be helpful? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think that the biggest thing is that the most helpful thing that I've seen on campus in terms of outside support is when we receive support to the initiatives that I talked about that are helping to educate Jewish students. So the biggest thing that people that are not on college campuses can do is they can help support these initiatives, like, for example, people often give to Hillel and Chabad, but there's also initiatives that are being started now or in the past few years that are specifically related to combating anti-Semitism, whether it be the ARC initiative that AEPI is running, things like Stand With Us. Programs have popped up. There's so many programs that I get reached out to on a daily basis saying, hey, we want to help educate Jewish students. So the best way that you can support Jewish students on campuses is by giving to these initiatives and programs that are helping to educate.
By the way, I did not plant that answer, in all honesty. I just want to say here, too, we're very blessed to be in the state of Florida. Having grown up here, as the rabbi said, just down the street, gone to school in Florida at the University of Central Florida. My wife's a Florida Gator. I know there's a lot of different alumni here in this room. And what the Jewish students here are dealing with on campus, thankfully, is to a far lesser degree than what the students are dealing with in other places. So that's something worth noting. And I'll just wrap it up with one last question, Noah. We see some young people here in the room. Do you have any messages to them on what you'd like to see them consider doing when they get to campus?
I would say that the biggest thing you can do is be involved in Jewish life. Find your Jewish community, because it can, to be fully honest, it can be very lonely when you're in a classroom or just in a dining hall and you feel as if everyone around you is against you. And when you find a Jewish community, you find that you're not so alone. And what's so incredible is that when you find other Jews at universities, you immediately have another family, and they really will take care of you. And they'll be there for you. And so I highly encourage everyone here to seek out their Hillel, their Chabad, their SSI chapter, their AEPI chapter, and just find your Jewish community, find your support system, because unfortunately, it looks like we're going to need it. So,
Thank you so much, Noah. We had the pleasure of bringing Noah down to Florida this week. He's speaking for us at a variety of things, for API specifically. But anytime we could be a resource to the congregation here, please call on us. Jill happens to be intimately connected to API, and as are many members. It's great to be here with you all, and thank you so much for having us.
thank you.
Let me take the privilege of just asking you a question, because, as I said, we went to the same program. I went to 4 years at the joint program, Columbia University, and Jewish Theological Seminary. Then I stayed for 4 years and finished rabbinical school. 2 of those years were in Israel. So I came from, I don't know if we call it a bubble, but I lived in a neighborhood not far from here where I didn't even lock my bike. We didn't close the front door and lock it until we went to sleep. Right? It was very secure where I grew up and what I experienced. So I was afraid to go to New York and to go to Columbia. But here's the difference. I went to New York pre-Giuliani. So the streets of New York were not safe, literally. My first day at the joint program, I don't know if you experienced it, but the first orientation was 3 hours of how to stay alive and be safe, and all the rules, what you weren't allowed to do. Don't get off at that subway station. You can't walk Friday night unless you have at least 3 people walking with you. Girls can't go by themselves. The guys have to accompany them. It's like, I didn't know it hit me, right? So the streets weren't safe, and the subways weren't safe. But you know what was safe? Columbia University. Inside Columbia, I felt so secure. It was, first of all, a diverse community. Everyone got along. Professors were from, far left, far right, but they were never confrontational and always interested in knowing what we thought, agree, disagree. There was never a sense of fear or concern, even with the professors. So now we go decades later, and it's the opposite. It wasn't safe in the university. You were better at, the West Side bar across the street was safer, right? So what happened that these universities, particularly Columbia as a symbol, what transformed them? What steps were taken that over a number of decades from one of the friendliest schools, not just to Jews, but all minorities, open school with everyone feeling safe and belonging, to a place where a minority, a Jewish population, literally feared for its safety walking, or I know exactly where those encampments were, and you can't get anywhere without walking through there. That's where graduation was held there.
Well, they canceled graduation, but
right. What happened?
So I guess it's a great question, and we did have the same orientation for where you can get off and where you can't get off on the subway and everything. And when my dad first came to visit me, he didn't lock his bike and it got stolen after 30 seconds. True story. I think he's watching right now. He's going to hate that I said that. But what I'll say is that what happened is that it didn't happen overnight. So I like to explain that sort of, it's really indoctrination. Students have been indoctrinated, and I like to call it sort of this idea that, imagine that they have sort of been under this hypnosis, and October 7th was their wake-up word. And all of a sudden, students across, all universities, but in particular at Columbia, were sort of activated as sort of soldiers, and like there's a proxy war that's happening. These are proxy soldiers, right? So what's so important to understand is that, and what's so important for anyone here that's in high school or as children or grandchildren in middle school or elementary school, what's important is to recognize that this starts then. It starts early, and it starts with small exposure to sort of little anti-Semitic tropes, and then it becomes more about sort of colonialism, and it's this narrative of oppressor and oppressed. And that's really what's happening. This narrative of oppressor and oppressed is being pushed, and it's been pushed for the past 10, 15 years. And so students have sort of taken it in their formative years, and now that they're in college, they're being told that this terrible oppressor-oppressed structure that they've been told is something you have to fight against, that the Jews fit into it, or Israel, but really it's the Jews, fit into it as the oppressor. And so that's what's happening, is that they feel this desire to be on the right side of history, and it's, like I said, a multi-pronged effort that's been so well organized. I mean, look at the tents, by the way, in the encampment. They were all the same. And more than that, speaking as a college student, most of my friends can barely get out of bed for their 11 a.m. class. I can guarantee you that they did not coordinate an entire encampment, a nationwide encampment, but also they took over a building. I mean, they were able to take over a building, and they held on to it for 24 hours. I sat there glued to the sundial right on the middle of campus watching as I mean, I don't know who here has seen Les Miserables, but it was like watching the scene in Les Miserables when they're building the barricade right before intermission. They were throwing chairs at the windows, they were using a pulley system, they were chanting, they were singing, and I walked outside. I haven't shared this widely, but I walked outside that night, and there was a police officer standing there. I said, "Why aren't you inside the campus?" And he said, "Oh, it's a good question." I said, No, I'm being serious. Why aren't you? They're smashing windows. They have a hostage in there. They took a janitor hostage. He said, "Well, I have orders not to go in unless it gets worse." I said, "What do you mean worse?" And he said, "Unless someone gets shot, I'm not allowed to go on campus." So this is the issue. The issue is that there's no consequences. So these students have been, so it's a two thing. So the two answers are, students have been taught this narrative, and they're taught you have to be right, social justice, you should be on the right side of history, and at the same time, there's nobody enforcing that, nobody giving them consequences for their actions. I mean, this is what's happened, and this is how we got to the point that we got to.
Well, with efforts like you and others like you, it's going to change. It's going to change, and I think you're going to see it in a shorter period of time than you would ever believe. I think it's going to get better, but it won't unless there's more people like you on those campuses confronting this anti-Semitism, this false narrative, and more people like us raising our voices. And there's a lot of alumni here from very important universities. They have to let their voices rise.
The last thing I'll say, by the way, so alumni from universities, the greatest thing you can do in addition to giving to the causes that help educate is to call your administration and to take action specifically with your university, because these administrations, they don't have any pressure. There's no pressure being applied to them, and that's why they've been able to act sort of with such impunity, and why the students have been able to act with impunity. But anyways, thank you all so much. Shabbat Shalom.
Chazak v'ematz. Be strong. Thank you so much.